Hello and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at midday on Tuesday, February 4th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television. Recordings of this series of programs and links to the articles we refer to today can be found on the Facebook page for Aware of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. Comments on this program are welcome. Email us at carl, C-A-R-L, at newsfromneptune.com. Our program concentrates on the news of U.S. war-making, which is generally not reported, not by accident, in the U.S. media. Since 1945, the United States government has killed over 20 million people in wars in Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East, Latin America, and elsewhere, designed to maintain the worldwide economic hegemony that the U.S. inherited as the only largely undamaged major country in World War II. Russia, in contrast, lost some 27 million people in defeating Nazism. The U.S. lost 500,000 in all of World War II. We're distracted from war news this week by the impeachment nonsense, but of course that is the political establishment's purpose. Trump should be impeached immediately for war crimes he's committed, notably the assassination of a foreign leader, and not for the nonsense the House resolutions, which are based on his hesitation to provide weapons to kill Ukrainians. His predecessors had few hesitations in such matters. Incidentally, Jill Stein of the Green Party is one of the few U.S. politicians, even within the Green Party, who said anything sensible about this presidential murder. Quote, "Now this is grounds for impeachment." She was referring to the American drone strike on General Soleimani. "This is grounds for impeachment, treachery unleashing the unthinkable for Americans and people the world over. Trump asked Iraqi Prime Minister to mediate too, perhaps, but he asked the Iraqi Prime Minister to mediate with Iran, and then he assassinated Soleimani on a mediation mission. As a result, the Iraq Parliament and Prime Minister say that the U.S. troops should leave Iraq. The Prime Minister says real Donald Trump, as he styles himself on Twitter, called him, that is the Iraqi Prime Minister, to ask him to mediate with Iran, and then ordered a drone strike on Soleimani, the Iranian general. He says Soleimani was carrying a response to the Saudi initiative to defuse tension when he was assassinated by a U.S. drone in Iraq. There was a good letter in the local newspaper, the News Gazette, on the subject of this drone assassination by Ricky Baldwin, a friend of Aware. Ricky writes, "The illegal U.S. assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani should be sufficient grounds for additional articles of impeachment. Recent illegal airstrikes into Iran would be too. In committing these high crimes, President Donald Trump violated not only the UN Charter, but also the principle announced by the U.S. and other world powers in the Nuremberg trials that waging aggressive war or violations of sovereignty are capital offenses. The U.S. officially incorporated both into its own law. The claimed exception of imminent threat is a transparent lie. For any threat to be imminent, it must be in progress, not developing plans, as the administration claims about General Soleimani. Then it would be necessary to take out fighters, not planners. Officials now say there are no imminent threats, compounding the contradiction. Was Soleimani himself going to plant explosives? Add to this the recent report that Soleimani may have been in Iraq negotiating peace with Saudi Arabia. The Iraqi parliament has demanded that all foreign troops, of course U.S. and NATO troops, leave, but Trump refuses, further violating sovereignty. This after the U.S. invaded and overthrew the previous Iraqi state based on ridiculous lies. And before that, the U.S. and Britain had overthrown the elected Iranian government 50 years ago installing the Shah's brutal torture regime, which led to the Islamic Revolution. What success! Democrats may fear impeachment on such grounds, however, due to the risk for future Democratic presidents. All the more reason Republicans should support Trump's impeachment. That's, of course, passé now, apparently, but that was the conclusion of Ricky Baldwin's letter to the News-Gazette. This matter, the whole question of what grounds Trump should be impeached on, and the ridiculousness of the grounds alleged by the House, the matter was treated by Major Danny Sherson, a retired U.S. Army officer who served combat tours with reconnaissance units in Iraq and Afghanistan, and later taught history at his alma mater, West Point. He's the author of a memoir on critical analysis of the Iraq War called Ghost Riders of Baghdad, Soldiers, Civilians, and the Myth of the Surge. He's on Twitter and is worth following there. The Impeachment Show, Asking All the Wrong Questions on Ukraine, is the title of his article on antiwar.com this week. Apathy and misplaced priorities, the twin diseases of this generation. I spent this past Saturday, a week before, afternoon speaking through a bullhorn in opposition to war, or at least opposition to escalating the existing state of war with Iran, during a local rally as part of the International Day of Action on the subject. Street protests, to me, are always equal parts inspirational and disappointing. Even here in the People's Republic of Lawrence, Kansas, he was demonstrating at the University of Kansas, Lawrence, Kansas, a progressive island in a sea of reactionary militarist red, only about 40 folks showed up. Most were older hippie types, though a sprinkling of 20-something socialist and intersectional justice activists were visible in the crowd. The one notably absent demographic, in the largest university town in the state, was students. It was, frankly, an embarrassment to the storied University of Kansas as an institution. What a far cry, a shameful fall from grace, for a college and city that was a veritable war zone in the aftermath of President Nixon's Cambodia invasion and the killing of 4 students at Kent State University. Hundreds, then thousands, protested. The student union building was burned, gunfire exchanged with the police, the National Guard called in, and the entire city placed under curfew for a few days. Indeed, Little Lawrence was for years a flashpoint city in the anti-Vietnam War movement. These days, as I flippantly mentioned in my speech, a generation of some 30,000 KU students can hardly fathom looking up from their iPhones long enough to consider a boots-on-the-ground rally in the physical company of other human beings. Not that the KU student body isn't, at least vapidly, political. These kids are passionately concerned, at least in the medium of sidewalk chalk art and Snapchat activism, with 2 major issues: identity, race, gender, sexuality, politics, and, of course, reflexive anti-Trumpism. These are, on some level, important subjects. Nevertheless, any serious grasp of U.S. foreign policy and inherent American militarist imperialism seems distressingly lacking. As such, I'd argue that this Kansan microcosm of higher education-exposed youths reflects a general societal disease of misplaced priorities, especially when the Donald is involved. Nearly every vaguely liberal, generally affluent KU student one meets is genuinely obsessed with Trump, his racism, temperament, and especially the apparent necessity of his removal. If only they, along it must be said with the mainstream left-leaning media and Democratic Party establishment, could cogently articulate just why this president deserves as much. Which brings me back to Saturday's rally. Halfway through my 12-minute keynote rant, a woman, though undoubtedly meaning well, legitimately cut me off and bellowed, "Impeach him already." Odd, this, I reckon, as I lost my train of thought. Trump wasn't the core theme of my speech, but focused more on the value of dissent and long-term folly of U.S.-Iran policy, and I was quite certain I hadn't uttered the words Ukraine, Biden, or the phrase quid pro quo. My response was mercifully rapid and generally polite. Sure, I countered, impeach him, but for the right reasons. For enabling the terror bombing of Yemen, illegally assassinating a top leader of a sovereign nation, or escalating the unsanctioned chaos of American regional warfare, warfare in the Mideast. With that, the subject faded, and I pivoted back to the planned script in my head. Nonetheless, the woman's outburst, along with the multiplicity of impeach him signs in the crowd, one read, "Impeach the MF already," was instructive. To wit, any rational observer, do such Americans still exist, masochistic enough to have watched the last couple of weeks of wall-to-wall Ukraine-gate, impeachment charade cable news coverage, must conclude that Trump's show trial has perhaps ineluctably distracted the American people. Only a misdirected reality TV-style immersion of this caliber seems capable of elbowing the real scandals and crises of our times, the Afghan papers, egregious Soleimani assassination, no end in sight ongoing American forever wars, straight out of the headlines. What's more, lost in the impeachment fiasco and in the collective understanding of KU students, MSNBC talking heads, and Democratic lawmakers alike, is any concern, debate, critique, or even tough questions about the other potentially nuclear calamity of the day, America's aggressive, reckless Russia policy, specifically how U.S. actions in Ukraine under Trump, Obama, and other post-fall of the Berlin Wall presidents have foolishly stoked a new, equally dangerous, and highly unnecessary Cold War with Moscow. Why, a wildly discomfiting few dare to ask, was Washington considering arming a deeply problematic Ukrainian regime for a proxy war with Russia waged several thousands of miles from America's shores? Is this prudent policy? What's the next step? What follows? And how does this end? These strike this author, at least, as vital queries. Only don't expect to hear any semblance of such sensible discussion, not on America's campuses, corporate cable channels, or Capitol Hill. With that disconcerting state of public affairs established then, allow me to poke just a few should-be obvious holes in Washington's Ukraine policy and the bipartisan, but these days mostly Democratic, congressionally provocative Russia agenda and narrative. First off, it was two American presidents, Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, who first provoked Moscow by extending NATO's inherently anti-Russian alliance, and contravention to promises made by the latter president's daddy, right up into the heart of the old Soviet republics and sphere of influence. It was the U.S., its State Department and intelligence services, that helped stoke the democratic revolution, and democratic is in inverted commas, read coup, the coup that overthrew a duly elected, Russia-friendly president in Ukraine. It is Washington that props up the current, questionably legitimate Ukrainian regime, which alarmingly includes factions that are patently white supremacists and neo-Nazi. It should be clear that the point Sturgeon is making here is that the government that the Obama administration installed in Ukraine and is supposedly helping to defend itself by killing 13,000 of its fellow citizens who weren't happy with the coup, that government is the first government, that Ukrainian government is the first government in Europe since the Second World War to contain explicit Nazis, as it does. That's what we're killing people for in Ukraine. Finally, it is America, not for being Nazis, but for opposing Nazis. We're not killing them for being Nazis. We're killing people that Nazi-infused government is opposing. Finally, it is America which, along with Russia has chosen bellicosity over diplomacy by seeking to provide one side in the proxy war with inevitably escalatory lethal arms. He's talking about the killing in Ukraine, which is the responsibility of the Obama administration, and now, of course, the Trump administration. Seemingly oblivious to this inconvenient political context and these salient demonstrable facts, just this past Friday, that's Friday a week, the absurdist ringleader of the misdirected impeachment distraction, Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff, had the gall to announce that Trump's alleged Ukrainian interference conspiracy theater, and presumably the whole ongoing Eastern European conflagration, was, quote, brought to you by the Kremlin. Well, call me a pro-Russia Putin apologist, but my read on the uncomfortable facts surveyed above suggests a wholly different take. The dangerous proxy war in Ukraine and burgeoning Cold War with nuke-saturated Russia was largely brought to you by the White House in the Obama administration and the current administration. That's Danny Sherson, a retired Army officer, taught at West Point, and giving his account, which I think is far more accurate than most of the ones we've heard, of the impeachment show, as he says, asking all the wrong questions on Ukraine. I think that's right. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're trying to talk about the political events of the last week and the relation of those events to the war policy of the United States government. With that in mind, I want to insert here, I'd planned to talk primarily about the war with Iran, the essentially ongoing war with Iran, and the peculiar things that the United States government is doing in that regard. But I wanted to interrupt this script I'd put together on Iran at this point to say something about last night's Iowa Democratic caucuses, the complex system for choosing delegates to this summer's Democratic National Convention that the state of Iowa uses to kick off the presidential election season. Next week we'll see a primary in New Hampshire, but the Iowa caucuses are the first step in the actual selection of delegates for the Democratic National Convention. Ben Norton, who writes well on these subjects, says, are the same CIA tactics used for decades to rig and steal elections in other countries now being used back home in Iowa? Pete Guido Buttigieg must know the answer. He now openly claims to have won a caucus that Bernie Sanders clearly won, and he, Buttigieg, clearly lost. I think that's about right, an accurate summary of what happened last night. The reference, perhaps you caught the reference to Pete Guido Buttigieg. Guido, of course, Juan Guaido was the supposed president of Venezuela that the U.S. tried to insert in opposition to the elected president of Venezuela, whom the U.S. wants to supplant. Guaido is not able to accomplish what the CIA clearly meant him to do, which is depose Maduro and establish himself as the president of Venezuela. The suggestion that Buttigieg is embarked on a similar enterprise in regard to the Democratic nominee for president, the position that Bernie Sanders clearly leads in right now, is the point of referring to Buttigieg as Guaido. The spook's choice, spooks here is the old-fashioned meaning of CIA spies. The spook's choice, coup plotters and CIA agents fill Pete Buttigieg's list of national security endorsers. Why are so many intelligence, using the word advisedly, veterans throwing their weight behind a young Indiana mayor with such a thin foreign policy resume? These questions continue to loom large over the 2020 primary field. Who is Pete Buttigieg, and what's he doing here? Seemingly overnight, the once obscure mayor of Indiana's fourth largest city has vaulted to national prominence with his campaign coffers stuffed with big checks from billionaire benefactors. The publication of a list of 218 endorsements from foreign policy and national security professionals, that's their title, by Buttigieg's campaign, deepened the mystery of the mayor's rise. I may have been unclear that what's being suggested here. The notion that Buttigieg's remarkable rise is owing to the fact that he's the CIA's candidate. Some observers have raised questions about Pete Buttigieg's intimate relationship with the national security state. After it was revealed that his campaign had paid nearly $600,000, campaign paid this, for security, that is armed defense, to a Blackwater-style military contractor. Buttigieg's new roster of endorsements from former high-ranking CIA officials, regime change architects, and global financiers should raise more questions about the real forces propelling his campaign. Pete's $180,000 payment to Patriot Group is a business, is by far the largest single security payment made by any presidential campaign for 2016 or 2020. You can imagine why these candidates might need security, cops, soldiers around them to defend them. But top of the list for arranging that is Pete Buttigieg, $180,000 up front. This is odd because he's a mayor of America's fourth largest city, not exactly a big target, and because they're in fact military contractors that he's hiring. Patriot Group is currently under contract with the U.S. military. They provide, quote, contractor-owned, contractor-operated intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aerial detection and monitoring support inside and outside the U.S. They're a private army, and they guard Mayor Pete. Buttigieg has offered precious few details about his policy plans, and foreign policy is no exception. His campaign website dedicates just 5 sentences to international affairs, none of which offers any substantive details. Beyond a 7-month deployment to Afghanistan as a naval reservist in 2010, the 37-year-old mayor has no first-hand foreign policy experience to speak of. As the Gray Zone's Max Blumenthal reported, the Gray Zone is an important website to follow on these matters. Max Blumenthal writes for them. Buttigieg enjoys a long relationship with the National Security Project, the Truman National Security Project, a foreign policy think tank in Washington, D.C. that advocates for, it's their phrase, muscular liberalism. He's also taken a short, strange trip to Somaliland with a Harvard buddy, Nathaniel Myers, who ultimately became a senior advisor to USAID's Office of Transitional Initiatives. They talk that way in Washington, but this has to do with American colonial activities in Africa. Otherwise, Buttigieg's foreign policy credentials are nil. Buttigieg's lack of core principles are what might make him so attractive to military contractors and financial institutions, 2 of the status quo's biggest beneficiaries. Mayor Pete has effectively positioned himself as a Trojan horse for the establishment, offering, quote, generational change, close quote, that doesn't challenge existing power structures in any concrete way. His resume includes eye-popping payments to a Blackwater-style mercenary firm. A review of Pete for America's, that's what his campaign is called, FEC, Federal Election Commission disclosures, found that the campaign paid $560,000 for security to a company called Patriot Group International from June 4th to September 9th, 2019. Buttigieg's August 29th payment of $180,000 to PGA represents the single largest security expenditure ever made by a presidential candidate, according to the FEC, Federal Election Commission. While the exorbitant amount of money raises questions, it's PGI's status as a Blackwater-style mercenary firm that makes Buttigieg's contract so remarkable. PGI bills itself as a, quote, global mission support provider with expeditionary capabilities, providing services to select clients within the intelligence, defense, and private sector. According to the company's website, it offers services like counterterrorism, counter weapons of mass destruction, and drone surveillance. PGI is currently under a $26.5 million contract with the Department of Defense to provide contractor-owned, contractor-operated intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance aerial detection and monitoring support inside and outside the U.S. This is what it does for the Defense Department. It's a far cry from securing campaign events held in New Hampshire community centers, which is what normally the security operation for a presidential campaign would do. Besides contracting with Buttigieg, PGI's only other record of political work was with Newt Gingrich's 2012 presidential campaign. In a 2016 INC magazine profile, PGI founder Greg Craddock said his company stopped doing political work altogether following a 2012 incident in which a PGI employee on Gingrich's security detail allegedly assaulted an overzealous Ron Paul supporter. Why the mercenary firm chose to re-enter politics for the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, remains an open question. Whatever the reason, Buttigieg's willingness to line the pockets of military contractors as a candidate might offer further insight into why so many in the national security state are lining up behind him. The CIA loves Mayor Pete. Buttigieg's lengthy roster of endorsements is loaded with former intelligence operatives, national security hardliners, regime change specialists, and vulture capitalists. Among Buttigieg's most notable endorsers is David S. Cohen, the deputy director of the CIA from 2015 to 2017, and a former Treasury official under George W. Bush. Cohen is regarded as a chief architect of the crippling sanctions that the Obama administration imposed on Iran, Russia, and North Korea, earning him the ignominious nickname, the, quote, sanctions guru, close quote. This is the man who is endorsing Buttigieg with his background and Bush and Obama sanctions activities. Pete Buttigieg's backer and former CIA Director David Cohen, since leaving government, Cohen has made various think tank appearances to advocate for continued use of sanctions in the aforementioned countries as well as Venezuela. Sanctions, as the U.S. is employing right now, is nothing short of an act of war. The impact of sanctions imposed under Cohen's watch has been equated to collective punishment, resulting in economic crises, food and medicine shortages, and tens of thousands of preventable deaths. In his tenure at the Treasury Department, Cohen was also instrumental in drafting the Patriot Act, which restricted civil liberties and vastly increased the government's surveillance powers in response to 9/11. Cohen has yet to speak publicly as to why he endorsed Buttigieg. Buttigieg was likewise endorsed by Charlie Gilbert, former Deputy Director of the National Clandestine Service, a top 10 leadership position at the CIA. Gilbert's role was, quote, to conceive, plan, and execute complex intelligence operations against hostile target countries, close quote. This is the backing of Buttigieg's campaign. Another Buttigieg endorser, John Baer, is the former Chief of Staff for the CIA's Middle East Task Force. Dennis Bowden, a 26-year CIA veteran, with much of that time spent in unspecified executive leadership positions, that's all they would say, is also backing Mayor Pete. The Buttigieg campaign has cited the support of former CIA senior analyst Sue Terry, who made, quote, a record number of contributions to the president's daily brief during her tenure from 2001 to 2008, the Bush administration. 2 more CIA endorsements came from former senior intelligence officer Martin Rasser and former senior analyst Andrea Kendall Taylor, who is also an officer at the National Intelligence Council. If you're thinking, wow, that's a lot of CIA endorsements for a relatively unknown small-town mayor, you're right, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. More Buttigieg backers included Ned Price, the career CIA analyst who resigned publicly in a February 27 protest against, quote, the way Trump has treated the intelligence community. Let's be clear what's going on here. They're objecting to Trump's moves, such as they were, to fulfill his campaign promises to pull back from the American wars around the world. CIA people resigned because Trump had not got with the program of wars and more provocations followed by the American presidency. Price was also a major Clinton donor, but insisted his resignation was nonpartisan. And in a sense it was. It was a resignation against anyone who would move against the war-provoking and warmongering of all recent American administrations, Republican and Democrat. Another CIA Buttigieg endorser is Jeffrey Edmonds, who moonlighted as a National Security Council member under Presidents Obama and Trump. Buttigieg was also endorsed by Chris Barton, the CIA's Assistant General Counsel during the Clinton administration, and Anthony Lake, whom Clinton nominated unsuccessfully to serve as CIA Director in 1996. Mayor Pete's list of spook supporters, spook in this case meaning CIA, spy, Mayor Pete's list of spook supporters similarly includes non-CIA intelligence community professionals like Robert Stasio, the former chief of operations at the NSA Cyber Center, and William Wexler, former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Special Operations in the Department of Defense. Buttigieg also named Robin Walker, a former Deputy Intelligence Officer for the Director of National Intelligence, as a supporter. Walker now works for corporate weapons contractor Lockheed Martin. Regime change hitmen and debt columnists jump on the bandwagon. Yet some of Mayor Pete's most troubling endorsements come from outside the military intelligence apparatus. Buttigieg, for example, lists Fernando Cutts as an endorser. For the first 16 months of the Trump administration, Cutts was the National Security Council Director for South America, where he led U.S. policy on Venezuela and was credited with outlining regime change plans for the president. Since leading government, Cutts has continued to support the Trump administration regime change efforts against Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. As Max Blumenthal reported for the Gray Zone, Cutts attended a secret meeting in the D.C. think tank CSIS dedicated to exploring U.S. military intervention in Venezuela. Another Buttigieg endorser is Jessica Wright-Skirton, who spent several years in leadership at USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives, what they're transitioning, working alongside Buttigieg's close friend Nathaniel Myers. There's also plenty of excitement for Buttigieg at the commanding heights of international finance. Matt Kaczmarek, vice president of BlackRock, the world's largest investment manager, controlling nearly $7 trillion in assets, is listed as an endorser of the South Bend mayor. Kaczmarek previously served as the NSA's director for Brazil and Southern Cone affairs in the Obama administration when the U.S. backed a right-wing parliamentary coup against President Dilma Rousseff. Kaczmarek is a perfect embodiment of the revolving door through which high-ranking government employees enter the private sector, reap the rewards of policies they previously helped implement. In 2013, while Kaczmarek was crafting U.S. economic policy towards Brazil, Then Vice President Joseph Biden was urging the country to open its economy further to foreign capital. From 2014 to the present, BlackRock has substantially increased its investment in Brazil, according to the Amazon Watch report. Now at the helm of the company, Kaczmarek stands to profit handsomely from the same economic liberalization policies that Brazil was goaded into adopting at his direction. Buttigieg's list of endorsers likewise includes Karen Mathiasson, former acting executive U.S. director at the World Bank, as well as Julie Tay Katzman, COO of the Inter-American Development Bank. Both organizations have a long history of using debt to impose the will of U.S. policymakers onto poor countries. Mathiasson, who previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Debt and Development Policy at the Treasury Department, was intimately involved in the administration of what has been dubbed debt colonialism. Under this cynical practice, unsustainable levels of debt are used as a pretext to demand that debtor nations privatize government functions, impose austerity, and allow greater exploitation by global capital. The IDB, where Katzman worked, plays a similar role in forcing the Washington Consensus across the Western Hemisphere. Wielding debt as a weapon, IDB policies maintain Latin America's subordinated place in the global economy, argues Professor Victor Sepulveda, author of Industrial Colonialism on Latin America, the Third Stage. Obscure presidential candidates don't typically garner hundreds of elite national security endorsements before a single vote is cast. So what do these spooks and vulture capitalists see in Mayor Pete? It can't be Buttigieg's former foreign policy resume, because he doesn't have one. He hasn't proposed any notable policies to distinguish himself from the other corporate-friendly candidates, so that can't be it either. Some have posited that Mayor Pete may be a CIA asset himself, but the supporting evidence is circumstantial at best. It may be circumstantial, but there is a lot of it. Perhaps the most reasonable conclusion is that they see Buttigieg as an empty vessel, opportunistic and unmoored by ideology or political goals beyond his advancing his career. Buttigieg is the ideal candidate for those who seek to maintain existing hierarchies. Indeed, his national security endorsement list is filled with people who keep America's imperial machine humming along smoothly. What is the thread that connects the CIA, USAID, and the World Bank? All three institutions exist to prop up a grossly unequal global order in which a tiny sliver of the population hoards unimaginable wealth, while the mass of people get by on next to nothing. At a time when that order looks increasingly untenable, with anti-austerity protests breaking out from Chile to France to Lebanon, Mayor Pete makes perfect sense. This is an article by Samuel Finkelstein, who is suggesting that the enthusiasm for Mayor Pete is a artifact of America's policy towards the rest of the world and the sort of American economic hegemony that all administrations, Republican and Democrat, for more than a generation have insisted upon. I think, in fact, the evidence that's adduced here and elsewhere suggests that the relationship is perhaps even tighter than that, that in short, Pete Buttigieg is the CIA's candidate, or as we prefer to say these days, the intelligence community's candidate for President of the United States. And it's no accident that he's done well with the remarkable political and financial backing that's come from that darkest part of the American political establishment. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about American war making, and the occasions of it and how it's happening. I want to say something more about the ongoing war with Iran. Really, I think has to be described that way. And I have an account here that seems to me appropriate in the wake of the American assassination of the Iranian general in Iraq, and a description of what, in fact, Iran did in response to that, a matter that I think has been perhaps overshadowed by our domestic politics, impeachment, and electoral. On the 3rd of January, after midnight, news about the assassination of Iranian Major General Qasem Soleimani, Brigadier General Hussein Pourjafari, Colonel Shahroud Muzaffari Nia, Major Hadi Tamereh, and Captain Wahid Zamanian reached the Iranian embassy in Baghdad. What had happened was that the U.S. government sent a drone strike, a missile, into the plane carrying these people, this is on the ground, in Iraq. The assassination of the leading Iranian general was, in the circumstances, a remarkable and illegal, by any stretch of the imagination, assault on the government of Iran. Officers at the embassy, that is the embassy in Tehran, the embassy in Iran, were in contact with the convoy that took General Soleimani to Iraq, and suddenly the communication was interrupted. Sadr Soleimani had diplomatic immunity and had been officially asked by the Iraqi government to help in defeating ISIS. Moreover, the convoy was attacked just before an Iraqi checkpoint that knew the Iraqi commander, Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, was in convoy along with his protection team. The news was communicated to Tehran, and from it to the house of the Iranian leader of the revolution, Sayyid Ali Khamenei. This was when the United States droned the Iranian general in Iraq. We belong to Allah, and to Him we shall return. These verses of the Quran a believer would pronounce when the death of someone he knows is announced, whether close to him or not. It's a reminder that all humans are mortal. That was the first reaction of Sayyid Khamenei when the news reached him of the death of a son. That was Sadr Soleimani's closeness to Sayyid Khamenei. Soleimani earned the title of living martyr due to the many occasions his life was in danger while fighting ISIS and al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria. Soleimani left Beirut and slept in Syria on the 1st of January, not far from the Damascus airport. On every trip to Syria, he used to hold a meeting with all commanders after morning prayers and just before the sun rises for a maximum of 2 hours. That day he kept all commanders for lunch and allowed them to leave just before sunset. He didn't stop talking, leaving his instructions for his team of commanders in the Levant. Captain Wahid Zamanian used to be his inseparable companion. The Major General was greeted by Iranian and Iraqi officers at Baghdad airport when arriving, where a U.S. drone assassinated them. According to a well-informed source within the Axis of Resistance, that is the association of states in the Middle East under attack by the United States, when he learned about the assassination, Sayyid Khamenei called for a meeting of his commanders in the first hours following the murder and instructed, this is the Iranian leader talking to his commanders after the general was killed by the U.S., he says, "Prepare yourself for a strong reply. We shall announce our direct responsibility so our enemy knows we are challenging face to face and not in the cowardly way the U.S. killed Soleimani and his companions." The enemy here, of course, is the United States, and Iran is instructing its commanders to make clear that this is a response to that murder. Hit the U.S. Army hard to break their arrogance, and the same theater they have executed this vile assassination. Close quote. Many scenarios were laid down in front of Sayyid Khamenei. The first choice was Ain al-Assad, the most significant and most substantial air base in Iraq, where President Trump landed in what he considered the safest location in Iraq. Iran knows every single detail about the base. Its drones and intelligence were good enough to identify the contents of every hangar and construction. A plan for a second hit was also prepared against a U.S. base outside Iraq, across the Persian Gulf, more powerful and painful than the first objective, in case the U.S. responded to the Ain al-Assad hit. A third hit was also organized, much more powerful and destructive than the first two, against the most significant U.S. base in the Middle East. This hit aimed to cause many casualties, many more than the U.S. other possible retaliation. These were the things that the Iranian government was planning to do or were setting out as possibilities in response to the American assassination. 3 plans, 3 scenarios, all planned to be executed one after the other for 3 consecutive hits. Khomeini approved all these responses, so there would be no need for his commanders to ask for his blessing. After that, Khomeini instructed his commanders to return to him for further instructions and to declare a general mobilization of the country, Iran, where an all-out war would be announced against the U.S. if there were military responses to all the Iranian hits. In this last scenario, Khomeini ordered a plan where hundreds of missiles would have been launched simultaneously against all U.S. military bases in the countries surrounding Iran and the Levant and beyond. All Iran allies in the Middle East would have been involved, and U.S. allies would be directly hit. But this ultimate decision would require the last evaluation by Khomeini himself. That was a foreseeable scenario that the U.S. president, with his decision to stand down, notwithstanding the human casualties and destruction inflicted on al-Assad military base, managed to avoid. Trump avoided this plan that Iran had set out for responding to the assassination of Soleimani. Iran didn't use any missiles in its silos to hit U.S. targets in Ain al-Assad. On the contrary, missiles were deployed overtly and prepared for launching 2 days before under the eyes of U.S. satellites. Messages were flocking to Iran from diplomats asking to refrain from retaliating or at least to soften the response. All requests were turned down. Iran avoided surprising the U.S. Had Iran wanted to surprise the U.S., missiles would have been launched from its silos with no warning. It was a direct challenge to U.S. hegemony. Moreover, Iran informed the U.S. that the hit was coming, further challenging President Trump and his military apparatus in the Middle East by showing that Iran was not afraid of the consequences. Iran sent its drones over Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and other nearby countries in daylight over U.S. bases. It was a signal that Tehran, the Iranian government, was prepared for war and an indication of some of its Iranian bank of objectives. The Iranian leadership was ready to go to the point of a no return if necessary. No one in Iran accepts giving up the missile program that has become the pride of the Iranian people and its armed forces. When the U.S. bombed hundreds of Russian contractors in Syria, Deir ez-Zor, who were crossing the Euphrates River to chase ISIS remnants, Russia decided not to respond. No country or army in the Middle East ever challenged the U.S., notably when the U.S. deployed tens of thousands of troops and effective equipment in the Middle East. Only Iran has directly challenged U.S. hegemony and military power. The axis of resistance, that is Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah in Lebanon, confirmed the balance of fear and imposed a deterrence policy on the U.S. and the Middle East. Iran overtly challenged the U.S. and declared its responsibility with no fear of the consequences. So far, the U.S. confirmed at least 64 casualties suffered. Some time ago, Iran announced that U.S. casualties were not less than 80, and indeed the American government has slowly and quietly increased the number of people it says were actually injured by the Iranian response. President Trump thought he was living an historical moment in his life when he could do anything he wants with no fear of consequences. He believed, and he was told this obviously by some of his advisors, he believed no country in the world would dare to challenge him. He also advised that Iraq was divided, that no government could contest violation of its sovereignty, and that Iran is no longer tolerated in Mesopotamia. These are all the things that the neocons and the presidential staff were telling the president. He was most likely informed that the burning of 2 Iranian consulates in Iraq was enough to kick Iran out of Iraq. Perhaps he imagined that assassinating Qasem Soleimani would go unpunished, and he bragged about killing, quote, 2 for the price of 1. He also killed the leader of the PMU units, the militia units in Iraq that are associated with Iran. He and his warmonger team also wrongly believed, and I guess still fine, that his maximum pressure and harsh sanctions would bring Iran onto its knees, begging him for mercy. He said he would be waiting by the phone for Iran to call, proving his ignorance of Iran, its mentality, culture, patience, harshness, and pride to call. Of course, didn't come. The magic turned against the magician, and Trump gave Iran a massive gift by allowing it to bomb his army and challenge him face to face. Trump was afraid to announce the number of casualties in the first week. The Pentagon is now releasing a part of the reality bit by bit every week. The U.S., not Iran, has shown fear. All U.S. military bases have become a threat to the hosting countries in the Middle East. These bases no longer serve to protect these countries, but have become perfect targets for Iran in case of war. They provide an overwhelming list of targets for Iran. No place will be safe for U.S. forces in the Middle East if red lines are crossed, as happened with the assassination of Soleimani. This situation is one that has been obscured by the fact that we are concentrating on our domestic politics and not paying attention to the warmongering of the United States in the Middle East, particularly in regard to Iran. A week ago Monday, a United States Air Force bombardier E-11A communications and intelligence gathering jet was either shot down or crashed in a remote mountainous region of Afghanistan. Almost immediately, a story sourcing Taliban officials ran on Iranian state television claiming that the dead had included Michael Dandria, the chief of the Central Intelligence Agency's Special Iran Task Force, which goes by the name Iran Mission Center. This is all murky and unclear what actually happened in the plane crash in Afghanistan, but the notion that the crash killed the CIA's chief of its terror war against Iran is particularly interesting. Whether Dandria was the target, in fact, of an operation that led to the crash of this plane, or whether indeed he was, as suggested, possibly killed by the activity. U.S. forces were hampered by weather, Taliban gunfire, and terrain from reaching the site of the crash for more than 24 hours. The lack of any kind of definitive commentary from Washington gave the story legs. There was nothing said or denied in D.C. Given the news vacuum in the story, the Iranian count was picked up throughout the Middle East to include photos allegedly taken of the downed plane and of burned corpses. Russian media also featured this story, was eventually even reported, though with some editorial skepticism, by British newspapers in London. The Pentagon eventually issued a brief report that the crash appeared to be accidental, perhaps due to weather, and stated still later that the pilot and co-pilot, both Air Force officers, had been killed. The statement of the media did not explicitly say whether or not there was anyone else on board the plane, which is capable of carrying additional crewmen and passengers. The CIA refused to comment. Fully 48 hours after the crash, the Pentagon released a second statement confirming the identity of the 2 crewmen who died. The mainstream media in the U.S. dutifully replayed the government version of what had occurred, but that did not stop a wave of speculation regarding a possible cover-up. Some reason that the Iranians, who were cooperating with the Taliban against U.S. forces, seemed to be on top of the story first, indicating that they might have known what occurred in real time because they had been in the loop with the Taliban armed unit that may have shot the aircraft down using a Russian-produced portable anti-aircraft missile launcher. Many who were following the story were inclined to believe the account circulated by Iran and other media outlets because the United States has a recent track record of lying about nearly everything, including the imminent threat details of its recent assassination of Iranian Major General and Quds Force Commander Qasem Soleimani. The U.S. also lied when it claimed that there had been no casualty on the American forces after Iran struck back against 2 bases in Iraq, and many observers are quick to note the United States has as its chief executive a man who calls journalists the enemy of the people and who is constantly claiming that there exists a huge reservoir of fake news. So another lie by the Pentagon is reporting the possibly successful attempt to kill a senior CIA officer would be expected by nearly everyone, which is not to suggest that the Iranian account was necessarily true or accurate in all details. Iran would have had plenty of motive to create confusion about the United States and what it was doing in Afghanistan, particularly if the implication is that Afghanistan was being used as a launching pad to destabilize or even attack Iran, with which Kabul is not at war. The White House and agency have neither confirmed nor denied that the CIA chief of the RAND Mission Center, Michael D'Andrea, is still alive. That's interesting in itself. He has, in any event, an interesting history. He's apparently a near contemporary of the authors, though I did not know him and do not know if that's his true name. He is reported to be undercover. The fact that a name is service at all is due to an investigative reporter on him in the U.S. media. A former chief of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, he was appointed to his current position by then agency director Mike Pompeo in June 2017. The New York Times reported that his appearance on the scene would mean a much harder line in opposing Iran on the part of the Trump administration. And we know, of course, that Pompeo has been pressing for war against Iran all along. Within the agency, the CIA, D'Andrea was reportedly referred to as the Dark Prince, or Ayatollah Mike, nicknames he acquired while heading the search for Osama bin Laden and also while directing drone strikes against al-Qaeda targets in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq, as part of Obama's Terror Tuesdays. As a chain-smoking, observant convert to Islam, man who's an American by birth, he converted to Islam to marry a wealthy woman from an Islamic family, and became a Muslim when he wed her. As a chain-smoking, observant convert to Islam, he is not your conventional agency officer, many of whom are more comfortable working inside an embassy desk rather than from a helicopter. A workaholic who keeps a roll-away bed in his office, D'Andrea, as a result of his abrasive style, reportedly extremely difficult to work with and not terribly popular. One might also speculate that the claimed killing of D'Andrea is something like a half-truth that might be construed as a warning. The CIA officer might still be alive, but it's completely possible the tale of his death was something of a contrivance to serve as a warning coming from the Iranian government, suggesting that if the American government can kill senior Iranian officials, American senior officials might likewise also be targeted. Even if D'Andrea was not on the plane, he just might come to the conclusion that his movements are being monitored. U.S. bases overseas are full of local employees who are engaged in menial tasks like driving or cleaning, even for perimeter and other basic security. Any number of them might be reporting on the movement of important Americans to the Taliban and other interested parties. D'Andrea and other senior U.S. government officials have inevitably had to think twice and increase their security arrangements when next they venture forth. And even an obstinate White House will perhaps begin to think that killing men like Soleimani is not a good idea, because if we continue to do it to them, they will turn around and do it to us. You've been listening to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana. in the, what is it, the 14th, no, I've lost, on the 4th of February, 2020. Our thanks to our directors, Jason Liggett and Ethan Young. Thanks to them also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube and archive.org. Thanks to our researcher, Jeff Nicholson, whose notes are on the Facebook page for Aware of Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Assange, Manning, Snowden, and others, real whistleblowers, truth-tellers persecuted by the American government, including our liberal Democratic Senator Durbin, a shill for the Russiagate propaganda and unconstitutional attacks on the free press, notably in the case of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, who is being tortured in prison by the U.S. government for the crime of telling the truth about our government's war crimes, something most Americans thought happened only in dictatorships, and perhaps they're right. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for the members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, saying in the words of the late newsman Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.